Tonight, as the world outside dims and your eyes begin to soften with the quiet pull of sleep, let me take you far away to a land long buried beneath the dust of Anatolian hills. There, in the cradle between mountain and plain, the wind still carries echoes of chariot wheels, of kings once mighty and forgotten by time. This is the story of the Hittites, a mysterious and powerful people who rose from obscurity, forged a vast empire, clashed with pharaohs, and then vanished. Their world is not often spoken of today, but it was once the equal of Egypt and Babylon, a land of stone citadels, golden treaties, and secret gods. The Hittites didn't build towering pyramids or sprawling ziggurats. Instead, they carved their legacy into rock and silence, waiting patiently for someone like you to rediscover it. Tonight, we're not just recalling dates or names. We're walking ancient streets. We'll drift through the mighty capital of Hattusa, feel the heat of a blacksmith's forge in the glow of the Bronze Age, and sit quietly in the chamber of kings as they whisper to their scribes. There are wars, yes, but also lullabies written in cuneiform, festivals to forgotten deities, and letters sealed with the breath of diplomacy. So, wherever you are listening from, whether you're lying beneath city lights or curled up far from the noise of the world, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are? Are you listening from a quiet room, a dim train cabin, or perhaps a hammock under the stars? Share with me, if you wish, your place in the world as we explore one that's long gone. And as your thoughts slow and your breath settles, remember, this isn't just history. It's memory, soft and half-remembered, waiting to carry you gently into sleep. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. In the beginning, there was no empire, no towering gates, no golden treaties etched into clay. There was only the land. Rugged and wild, Anatolia, the high plateau we now call Central Turkey, stretched out beneath a ceiling of wide sky and drifting cloud. The land was ancient, even then. Its hills whispered with wind and wolves, forests bent beneath storms. Rivers carved stories into stone long before men began to write them down. And into this land, somewhere around 2000 BCE, came a people whose name would one day echo through forgotten chambers and archaeological maps: the Hittites. But back then, they were not yet Hittites. They were wanderers, Indo-European in language, arriving in waves and trickles. They settled among older peoples, the Hattians and Hurrians, whose tongues were strange and thick with consonants. But the newcomers listened. They blended, they adapted, and in doing so, they became something new, something neither native nor foreign. The highlands welcomed them cautiously. This was no fertile Nile or soft Mesopotamian plain. Anatolia demanded patience. Its fields were stubborn, its winters bit. But beneath its skin, deep below rock and root, there slept a treasure: metal, copper, tin, silver, gold, and iron. These were not just tools. They were keys to power, to trade, to to survival. In these early days, the ancestors of the Hittites lived in small kingdoms, each nestled among the hills like tiny lanterns flickering in the dark. The most powerful of these was Kanesh, known today as Kultep, a bustling trade colony. Merchants from Assyria traveled north to do business there, bringing with them not just spices and cloth, but writing, cuneiform. They came with long, slow caravans, donkeys, scrolls, ideas. The locals watched and learned. From these interactions, the future Hittite scribes would be born, their minds trained in foreign script, their hearts rooted in native earth. In Kanesh, we can glimpse the seeds of what would one day become an empire. Letters preserved in baked clay tell us of marriages arranged, debts argued over, love confessed. They are soft voices, caught in time, voices that remind us even the great were once small. From these city-states emerged one man whose name would echo like a footfall across history. His name was Labarna. Or perhaps that wasn't his name at all. Some say Labarna was a title, not a name meaning great king or founder. A word spoken with reverence, like a sunrise after winter. Whoever he truly was, this man, or perhaps the legend of him, marks the beginning. Around the 17th century BCE, Labarna united scattered lands under one banner. His influence reached far into river valleys and up into forested highlands, where small lords bowed their heads and offered tribute. And in doing so, he laid the first stones of what would one day be called the land of Hatti, not after his own people, but after those who had come before. It was a gesture of quiet respect, or perhaps of clever politics. The Hattians were ancient, and their gods were still strong in the minds of the people. To take their name was to inherit their legitimacy, as though the land itself had given its blessing. Even in these early years, the Hittites, if we may now call them that, proved themselves masters of absorption. They did not erase the old. They wrapped themselves in it, wove it into their laws, their myths, their rituals. Hatchin gods were kept alive. Hurrian songs were sung at royal weddings. The empire to come would not be a monolith, but a mosaic, and so the foundation was laid. The Hittites settled into hilltop cities, fortified by stone walls and crowned with watchtowers. They built their homes with timber and earth, their temples with silence and shadow. Smoke rose from hearths, shepherds called out across golden plains. Bronze knives were shaped in glowing forges, and in the cool corners of palaces, scribes whispered over tablets, pressing wet clay with styluses, carving memory into permanence. But life was not peaceful. Rival kings circled like vultures. Tribes from the west, the Luwians, the Arzawas, pressed against borders. In the east, Assyria stirred with ambition. Each spring brought not only flowers, but war. Yet the Hittites endured, quietly, steadily, not by overpowering, but by enduring like stone worn smooth by water. They watched, they waited, they learned, and through it all, The land held them, the land that was both cradle and crucible. The Anatolian hills bore their cities like beads on a necklace, each connected by dusty roads and secret paths. Messengers galloped from one to the next, bringing news of births, of omens, of enemies drawing near. These hills saw everything. They watched as kings were crowned and murdered. They listened as prayers rose up to sun gods and storm lords. They bore witness as grain was sown, as temples were raised, as treaties were broken and reforged. And still, the land remained. So if you close your eyes now, gently, slowly, perhaps you can hear it. The wind rustling through ancient pine, the quiet murmur of a distant stream, the low hum of a forge at dusk. The Hittites were born here, not in triumph, but in tension, between mountain and plain, between past and future. And now we begin to follow them. And just beyond the horizon, there waits a city of stone, carved into cliffs and dreams, a city unlike any other, where lions guard the gates and gods whisper from the shadows. The heart of the Hittite world, Hattusa. The road to Hattusa winds gently through the highlands, where the hills wear a robe of dry grass and wild thyme. The sky here feels close, like it might settle on your shoulders if you pause long enough. And then, through the hush of wind and the scattered calls of crows, it appears. At first, it's only the outline of crumbling walls against the pale blue. But then you begin to see the gates, great stone mouths carved into the earth, each one guarded by lions, sphinxes, or solemn-eyed gods. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, was not built in haste. It was carved from patience, chiseled into the bones of a hillside. It rests in a natural fortress, cliffs to one side, a valley sprawling below, and everything about its design whispers of strength in silence. You enter through the lion gate, and though time has worn down their teeth, the guardians still seem to breathe. Their eyes, smooth with age, watch you like sentinels in a dream. Inside, the city doesn't unfold like a planned grid. It twists and turns, following the land's own will. Stone-paved roads lead to terraces, courtyards, shadowed corridors. The walls are thick, made not only to keep out enemies, but to cradle those within. There are homes here, many, small and packed tightly. But what draws the eye is the upper city, where the temples wait. They rise slowly from the stone like memories returning. Low, flat-roofed structures built not for grandeur, but for mystery. The great temple, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, stands at the city's spiritual center. Its walls are lined with storerooms, dozens of them, filled once with jars of oil, grain, wine, offerings to gods now forgotten. Here, in the stillness of dusk, you can almost hear the sandals of priests shuffling over stone, the murmurs of chants, the rustle of linen garments. The air smells of dust and iron. Somewhere nearby, a forge glows quiet now, but once alive with the clang of tools and the hiss of water cooling metal. Hattusa was not just a holy city, it was a center of craft, of governance, of diplomacy. Scribes moved through its alleys, their hands stained with clay, carrying messages in languages only they could read. They wrote in Hittite, in Akkadian, in Hurrian, polyglot messengers in an empire of many tongues, and beneath it all, quite literally, ran secrets. Hattusa's builders carved tunnels and hidden corridors under the city, some for escape, others for sacred rituals. Even now, when you walk through one of these long, narrow passageways, the walls seem to lean in and listen. They remember the footsteps of kings. Above the city sits the royal citadel, Buyukale. To reach it, you climb. The steps are uneven, worn down by centuries of leather soles. And at the top, the air is cooler. You can see the whole of the city from here, its roofs, its courtyards, its distant fields where farmers once coaxed grain from stubborn earth. This was the seat of Hittite power, where kings ruled not from opulence, but from austerity. The palaces were functional, not grand, built for governing, not for glory. But make no mistake, the heart of the empire beat here, in this stone nest in the hills. From these chambers, kings issued edicts that shaped the fate of peoples far beyond the mountains. Ambassadors from Egypt, Babylon, and Mycenaean Greece once passed through these gates, bringing gifts, suspicions, and silken words. And the archives, those silent vaults, they held thousands of tablets, each one a voice sealed in clay. Letters between kings and queens, oaths sworn, gods invoked. In one, a message from a pharaoh. In another, a plea from a vassal king begging for aid. Together, they form a kind of heartbeat, the steady rhythm of an empire speaking to itself and to the world. At night, Hattusa would settle into a deep hush. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows on the stone. The priests retired to their quarters. The city exhaled. Only the stars, brilliant in the thin mountain air, remained fully awake. Somewhere, a mother sang a lullaby to a child, the melody drifting over rooftops into the dark. It's hard not to wonder what dreams filled the minds of those who lived here. Did they dream of gods, of battles won and lost, of distant cities they'd never see, or simply of tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's peace? But Hattusa was not eternal. For all its strength, its cleverness, and its sacred calm, the city would one day fall into ruin. Its walls would crack, its temples collapse, its people disappear into the folds of history. But in this moment, this soft, golden moment we linger in now, Hattusa still breathes, still lives. You can almost feel it beneath your feet, the slow warmth of stones that once knew the sun, the quiet sigh of wind moving through ancient rooms. And as you step away from the citadel, descending slowly back into the heart of the city, you carry something with you, not just knowledge, but presence, a sense that the past is not gone. It sleeps and dreams, dreams of kings who once stood here, looking out over their stone-wrapped city, wondering what would remain. Because just beyond the temple courtyards and echoing halls, a dynasty begins to rise, a line of kings that will expand the borders, shake the foundations of the known world, and write their names into the very marrow of time. One of them will be called Hattusili, and he will not wait quietly. The name Hattusili was not given lightly. It meant man of Hattusa, and to bear that title was to carry the weight of a city on your shoulders, a city carved from the bones of the earth and the breath of the gods. When Hattusili I took the throne, sometime in the 17th century BCE, he inherited not merely a seat of power, but a fragile dream, a confederation of lands, still young, still trembling at the edges. He was not the first king of the Hittites. Labarna had come before him, possibly his grandfather, or perhaps a myth woven into bloodlines to bind power with legend. But Hattusili was the one who carved ambition into stone. Under his reign, the scattered light of a dozen petty kingdoms began to gather into one flame. He moved the capital, or perhaps reaffirmed it, to Hattusa, a symbolic act, naming himself after the very city he now ruled. It was a declaration in stone. This is where it begins. And from this windswept fortress, he would stretch his hand far and wide, across rivers and deserts, down into the heartlands of Syria and beyond. But Hattusili's story is not one of easy conquest. It is written in struggle, in wounds, in betrayal, in decisions made beneath flickering torchlight and the weight of divine silence. He led campaigns southward, down into rich lands held by rival cities, Alalak, Urshu, and Yamhad. These were places older than Hattusa, wealthier, better connected. But Hattusili understood something vital. The Hittite strength was not in numbers, but in resolve, in the endurance of the highland people, in the quiet fire of their bronze. Year after year, his armies descended from the Anatolian heights like storms. They struck hard, took what they could, and left warnings in fire. Not just for spoils, though grain, cattle, and gold always followed, but to spread the name of Hattusa and of Hattusili. But each conquest came at a price. The terrain was difficult, the weather cruel, and the resistance bitter. Cities rose in rebellion the moment his chariots vanished behind the horizon. Alliances shifted like sand. There were whispers, always whispers, that some in his own court doubted him, feared his ambition, perhaps even plotted against him. Kingship in the Hittite world was not divine by birth. It had to be earned, year after patient year, and it could be lost in a single breath. Toward the end of his life, Hattusili was gravely ill. His body weakened, though his mind remained sharp, probing, watchful. In those final months, he did something that no conqueror wishes to do. He looked back. He composed what we now call his testament, one of the oldest personal documents left behind by a king. In it, he speaks of his victories and failures, of those who were loyal and those who betrayed him. He names his successor, not his son, but his grandson, Mursili, a boy, barely more than a shadow of the man he was expected to follow. Hattusili's tone in that testament is not boastful. It is weary, almost confessional. He knew the limits of power. He had seen how quickly a city could burn, how quickly friends could turn to enemies. And yet, he believed in the empire, in its future, in the boy who would carry his torch forward. And so, with the whisper of breath leaving a weary body, the first great king of the Hittites passed into silence, but not into oblivion, for mercifully, that young successor would not remain in the shadows for long. When he came of age, the child of Hattusa did not hesitate. He gathered armies, invoked the gods, and turned his gaze further than any Hittite ruler before him. He marched, and did the unthinkable. He crossed the great Euphrates, deep into the lands of Mesopotamia. And there, in a campaign that stunned even the hardened scribes of Babylon, he sacked the mighty city itself. Babylon, the jewel of the East. Its walls fell to the Hittite storm, and its treasures were carried north, not for wealth, but for proof. Proof that the Hittites had arrived, that they were no longer a mountain people scratching at the edges of civilization, but a force to be reckoned with. And yet, even this triumph could not guard against what was to come. For when mercifully returned, his glory fresh, he was betrayed, murdered by his own brother-in-law. A dagger, perhaps, a poisoned cup, we do not know, but we know the outcome. The throne that had been carved through sweat and steel now trembled again. The lines of power twisted. Civil war followed. The dream of empire, once burning bright in Hattusili's eyes, now flickered. But even as kings fell and cities smoldered, something remarkable endured. The idea, the memory, the sense that beyond these trials, a greater Hittite realm still waited, sleeping, perhaps, beneath the ashes of betrayal, but breathing still. And so, we leave this chapter not with the thundering certainty of victory, but with the hush that follows it, the silence after storm. A silence filled with uneasy hope, because while blood stains the throne and the gods look on in silence, there are those still praying in the temples, scribes still pressing clay, children still learning the names of their kings, and in the great dark of history, a flicker of light waits for the dawn of a new reign. Long before the first crown was forged, long before treaties were inked into clay and battle cries echoed across the valleys, there were the gods, not one, not 10, but hundreds. The Hittite world breathed divinity in every corner, every river bend, every mountain path, every flicker of lightning in a summer storm. They called it the 1,000 gods of Hatti, a phrase not meant to count, but to convey the infinite, the overwhelming presence of divine forces that wove themselves into every layer of existence. The Hittites did not worship one god above all. Instead, they listened for whispers from 1,000 directions, each god with a face, a mood, a memory. The king, in his palace, was not only a ruler of men, he was high priest of the realm, a mediator between the mortal and the sacred. His duty was not only to collect taxes and declare wars. It was to tend to the gods, to keep the old rituals alive, and to ensure that the invisible threads holding the world together did not fray. If the gods were angered, the crops would fail. If they were neglected, the skies would burn or darken or weep for weeks. It was a heavy burden, and yet it brought beauty, because everywhere you turned in the Hittite realm, there were signs of that divine dance. In quiet mountain sanctuaries, where only the wind and birds bore witness, priests whispered prayers to the storm god Tarhuns, the bringer of rain, the breaker of drought, the voice behind thunder. He was a towering presence in Hittite belief, both feared and loved. His symbol was the axe, but his true language was rain. Beside him stood the sun goddess of Arana, radiant and calm, the mother of order, of light, of life itself. Hers was the warmth of spring, the return of green, the steady eye in the heavens. She watched over justice and the sacred order of things. Together, she and the storm god formed a divine pair, reflecting the royal couple on earth, king and queen ruling in harmony. But the gods were not always gentle. There were darker spirits too, gods of plague, of the underworld, of chaos. Among them lurked Kumarbai, the biting father of storms, and Ulikami, a stone giant birthed from vengeance. Their stories, preserved on worn tablets, read like half-remembered dreams, filled with strange births, battles in the sky, and divine secrets whispered in tongues lost to time. The myths were not merely stories. They were memory, sacred echoes of cosmic battles that shaped the order of the world. And they were told aloud during great festivals, when the people of Hattusa gathered in the city's open squares or temple courtyards. The priests would reenact the tales, wearing masks and robes, singing the ancient words in ritual cadence. Drums would beat slowly, incense would curl upward, and the veil between worlds would thin just a little. The rituals were elaborate. At harvest time, the king himself might take part, offering grain and wine to the deities, walking barefoot through sacred fields to invoke fertility. In times of plague, priests would journey into the wild to perform purification rites, sprinkling water, burning cedar, chanting to drive away the unseen sickness. Sometimes the gods were silent. When crops failed and rivers dried, the silence could become unbearable. And so the people would try harder. They would fast, weep, offer their most valuable animals, sometimes even sacred weapons, anything to bring back the balance. What made the Hittite religion unique was not only its breadth, but its hospitality. The Hittites were open to adopting foreign deities, from the Hurrians to the Mesopotamians. From every land they touched or traded with, they added gods freely, like guests invited into a vast spiritual household. Each new city or region added its own patrons, and rather than replace the old, the Hittites simply made room. In this way, the 1,000 gods truly grew, stretching across language and lineage. Each city had its protectors, each temple its rituals, each season its festivals. And for all their power, the gods were not distant. They walked among the people in dreams, in weather, in the cry of a falcon, or the curve of a snake slipping through grass. The queen played a sacred role in all of this as well. She was not simply the wife of the king. She was high priestess of the realm. Her presence at rituals was essential. And some, like the mighty Pujuhepa in years to come, would shape the spiritual fabric of the kingdom as much as any male priest. There is a story told on one of the tablets of a time when the gods stopped listening. The people were afraid. The rains didn't come. The animals fell ill. The king and queen fasted, prayed, begged, and only when they uncovered a forgotten vow, a promise left unfulfilled by a previous king, did the gods respond again. The rains returned. The fields bloomed. It reminds us of the Hittite view of the sacred, a covenant, an agreement, not just obedience, but responsibility. The gods were not cruel, but they were just. They expected remembrance, attention, gratitude, and in return they gave protection, prosperity, the rhythms of life. As night fell over Hattusa, the temple altars would still glow with embers. The final offerings of the day, a bit of bread, a splash of wine, a lock of hair, would be placed in silence. The wind would carry the smoke into the sky, a thread between worlds. And somewhere in the upper city, perhaps the king would rise from his knees, brush the dust from his robe, and walk quietly back to his chambers, his thoughts still with the gods, his heart heavy with their silence or hopeful in their favor. Because for the Hittites, the divine was never far. It lived in the stone, in the flame, in the breath between words, and in the distance, beyond the edge of the temple walls, chariot wheels were already turning. A storm was gathering. The gods had been honored. Now the kings would take up arms once more. Before dawn, when the mist still hung low over the Anatolian hills, and the world had not yet stretched itself awake, the sound would come distant at first, like thunder tucked beneath the horizon, a rhythm heavy and deliberate. Not drums, not voices, but hooves, hundreds of them, and the grinding creak of wheels turning over stone. This was not a raid, nor a flight. This was a procession of power, a chariot column moving with purpose. The Hittites were going to war. In the history of ancient empires, there are few images as vivid as the chariot, not merely a vehicle of battle, but a symbol of status, technology, and raw, surging might, and none wielded it with the calm, brutal efficiency of the Hittites. They did not invent the chariot, no. That innovation likely belongs to the steppes and the older kingdoms of the Near East. But the Hittites refined it, perfected it. They made it lighter, faster, deadlier. Where the Egyptians used 2-horse chariots for archers, the Hittites used heavier, 3-man teams, a driver, a shield bearer, and a warrior. It was not elegance they sought, but impact. The Hittite chariot was a battering ram with wheels, and when it crested a hill at full speed, it was as if the mountain itself had chosen to descend into battle. They trained meticulously. Young nobles were raised with reins in hand. The horses were bred with care, sturdy, muscular, suited to the harsh Anatolian terrain. When war was not being waged, drills were held constantly. Not just how to ride, but how to communicate, hand signals, shouted codes, knowing when to veer and when to strike. But the Hittite philosophy of war went deeper than tactics. It was rooted in the old religion, in the belief that kings fought not only for land, but for the favor of the gods. Before each campaign, sacrifices were made. Omens were read. The gods were asked, "Do we go?" If the signs were favorable, the king would lead his army himself. If they were not, he would wait, no matter the cost. War was sacred. And so the campaigns would begin. Chariots in the front, infantry behind, a rolling tide of metal and dust. Their weapons were forged from bronze, swords broad and brutal, spears designed to penetrate armor. Shields were round, reinforced with wood and hide. Helmets bore crests and cheek guards. Each soldier was not just a fighter, but a moving part in the larger body of the army. They rarely moved blindly. Spies and messengers went ahead. Alliances were secured or broken with letters pressed in clay, carried by swift riders across mountain passes. And when battle came, it came with fury. The ground would shake as the chariots charged, wheels carving grooves into the earth. Arrows would fall like summer hail. Then the crash, the impact, as Hittite lines slammed into enemy formations. Infantry followed, shouting war chants that were as much prayer as tactic. It was not enough to win. One had to prove the gods were on their side. And yet, the Hittites were not bloodthirsty for its own sake. They did not fight without cause. When they conquered a city, they often allowed its ruler to remain, so long as he pledged loyalty and paid tribute. In this way, their empire expanded, not as a chain of smoking ruins, but as a network of vassal states bound by diplomacy and fear. War was the beginning of order, not the end. But not every battle went their way. The campaigns in Syria were long, grueling affairs. Cities like Carchemish and Kadesh did not fall easily. Rivals like the Mitanni and the Egyptians tested their strength again and again. At times, victories were hollow, a city taken, only to rebel weeks later. And the cost was always felt. Every war depleted grain stores, scattered families, broke horses, ended kings. One such king was Tuttalia III, ambushed, betrayed, lost in the wilderness of defeat. His fall opened the door to chaos, and from that darkness rose another figure. Suppiluliuma but his story waits. For now, we remain with the warriors. Imagine a Hittite soldier returning from battle. His armor is dented. His hands are blistered. He has seen friends die, has watched cities burn, has felt the gods in the thrill of victory and the cold of retreat. He returns not triumphant, but changed. The elders meet him with ritual, purifying him before he re-enters the city. War has stained him, and he must be washed in fire and water and silence. At night, in his home, he kneels before a small household idol, a storm god carved from stone. He offers thanks, or perhaps apology. It is not glory he prays, for it is peace and rest, and the hope that next season the king will not call again. Yet the chariots are always being readied, the wheels always turning, because as long as the borders stretch outward, as long as Egypt breathes, as long as Babylon whispers, the Hittite warrior must be ready to rise. The gods demand strength, and the empire, always hungry, listens for the sound of hooves. But war alone cannot sustain an empire. Behind the walls of Hattusa, in the winding streets and sunlit courtyards, another story unfolds, one of family, of daily labor, of songs carried on wind. Because when the swords are sheathed, the people must still live. When the gates of Hattusa closed each evening, and the fires in the royal courtyard dimmed to embers, another kind of life unfolded, softer, slower, and no less sacred. For while kings made treaties and chariots etched scars into the soil of distant lands, it was the people, the potters, the herders, the midwives, and scribes, who gave the Hittite empire its breath. A Hittite morning began not with alarms or proclamations, but with the sounds of life awakening, the rustle of grain sacks being opened, the low bleat of goats rising with the sun. Wooden shutters creaked as families greeted the dawn. The air carried the scent of barley porridge and baking bread, thick and coarse, sometimes spiced with thyme or onion, always shared. Most people lived in modest homes, made of mud brick and timber, their walls washed in white lime to keep away the heat of summer. Roofs were flat and often served as workspaces or resting places on cool evenings. Inside, floors were packed earth, covered with reed mats. There were no luxuries here, but there was warmth, a hearth, a few clay vessels, a carved idol tucked into a niche for blessing the day's work. Men rose early, many to tend the fields beyond the city walls. The Hittites were skilled farmers, coaxing crops from the stubborn Anatolian earth. Wheat and barley, lentils and flax, the grains of empire. Oxen pulled wooden plows, while children scattered seeds from woven baskets, singing old songs that called for rain. They watched the skies closely. A good season brought peace. A bad one summoned famine and often war. Women's hands kept the pulse of the home steady. They spun wool, wove cloth on vertical looms, kneaded dough, and gathered herbs from the hillsides. Some were midwives, others healers, trusted to soothe fever with honey and poppy, to close wounds with salt and incantation. The role of women was not hidden, it was foundational. Without them, no feast, no trade, no life could flourish. Trade was everywhere. Markets sprang up near temple squares. Farmers came with carts of vegetables and grain. Shepherds brought cheeses wrapped in leaves, skins of milk. Traders arrived with tin, lappies, oil, incense. One might barter for copper bracelets, or a pair of sandals, or a tiny clay amulet shaped like a lion for protection. Always for protection. In the background, the palace loomed not a place of gold, but of administration. There, scribes labored, hundreds of them, trained in the precise art of cuneiform. They copied contracts, treaties, lists of offerings, and the king's decrees, but also poems, hymns, prayers scratched into clay tablets with a care bordering on reverence. Boys learned their letters early if their families had means. A sharp mind could rise through the scribal schools, from low servant to advisor of kings. It was not common, but it happened. Intelligence in the Hittite world was a currency almost as valuable as metal. And for girls, many were taught the rhythms of ritual and song. Some became priestesses, trained to lead offerings, to understand dreams, to read the divine patterns in smoke and sacrifice. Others, especially in noble homes, would one day rule beside their husbands, queens with power not just of the heart, but of the law. The Hittite legal system was remarkably structured. Justice was not left to chance or vengeance. Courts heard cases of theft, of inheritance, of land disputes, and judgments were inscribed for reference. Punishments were not cruel for cruelty's sake. If a man stole grain, he might repay it with labor. If a neighbor's ox trampled your field, compensation followed. There was fairness here, or at least the pursuit of it, but not all was fair. Slavery existed. War captives were brought in from campaigns, assigned to temples or noble households. They were often absorbed into Hittite society over time, allowed to marry, to own property, to earn their way toward freedom. But in those first years, they were not free. And they, too, watched the seasons turn, just as everyone else did. Religious life ran through everything. Even a meal began with a nod to the gods. On feast days, whole towns would gather at the temple. There would be dancing, offerings of wine and honey, chants that rose in crescendos, then fell into hush. The gods were present not only in temples, but in rivers, trees, even rocks that bore strange shapes. To live Hittite was to live surrounded by spirit, by meaning. And in the quiet of night, the city breathed together. Old men told stories by firelight of how the storm god first tamed the sky, of how Babylon fell before Hittite fury, of how a king once wept before a mountain, and it rained. These tales, half believed, fully loved, bound generations together. Children listened with wide eyes, half dreaming, already slipping into the folds of memory that would outlive them. Sleep came early for most. There were no street lamps, only stars. Dogs barked in distant alleys. Somewhere, a lyre played softly. Perhaps a mother sang, a lullaby passed down from her mother and her mother before her. The same melody that once echoed in Labarna's time, the same notes that might be heard again centuries later, when ruins were all that remained. Because this, too, was empire. Not just chariots and kings, but meals cooked with care, words carved in clay, a quiet glance between strangers in a market, a prayer whispered to a household god, a song hummed into darkness. And while history often remembers only what burned or conquered, it is in these soft, enduring rhythms that the true soul of the Hittite world endured. Still, a kingdom cannot live on memory alone, and beyond the home and hearth, a different kind of craft was at work, one that shaped destiny not with songs or harvest, but with styluses and stone. For in the heart of the palace, the scribes wrote and remembered in a chamber not far from the palace courtyard, lit by oil lamps and the dull red flicker of evening. A figure sits hunched over a slab of wet clay. He is silent, focused. His stylus, carved from bone or wood, moves with care, deliberate, rhythmic. Each stroke is a thought made physical, each wedge and line a whisper to the future. He is a Hittite scribe, and in his hands, history is taking shape. Writing for the Hittites was no mere tool. It was a sacred act, a binding, a spell cast into time. The Hittites inherited their writing system from Mesopotamia, cuneiform, that odd, elegant script of wedge-shaped signs. But they did not simply borrow it. They adapted it. They wrote in multiple languages, their own Indo-European tongue, yes, but also Akkadian, the language of diplomacy, and Hurrian, Luwian, even Sumerian in some prayers and rituals. A Hittite archive might hold 5 tongues on one shelf. It was a world built in translation. And what a world it was. In the royal archives at Hattusa, discovered centuries later buried beneath layers of ash and stone, over 30,000 tablets once rested. Many still do. Tablets the size of a hand, some as large as paving stones. Records of treaties, yes, but also of marriages, dreams, festivals, medicine, and myth. Here, scribes recorded the names of kings and gods alike, both destined for forgetting. Had these soft slabs not survived the centuries? Imagine the labor. Day after day, lines of scribes sat cross-legged on reed mats, the clay trays before them smoothed with water, ready to receive words. A master would dictate slowly, carefully, and the room would fill with the soft tap-tap-tap of styluses at work. In warm weather, the clay would dry in the sun. In winter, fires were lit, and the tablets baked gently into permanence. There were specific scribes for specific tasks. Royal scribes, temple scribes, legal scribes, ritual scribes. Some trained for years before being allowed to record royal speech. Others copied foreign letters, practicing scripts again and again until the shapes became second nature. Errors were not forgiven lightly. A single misplaced which could change the meaning of a line. A scribe who misrecorded an oath might be blamed for divine anger. And still, they wrote. One of the most fascinating things about the Hittite written world is how intimate it could be. Among the formal decrees and religious rituals, there are letters, deeply personal, achingly human. A queen writing to her sister, a vassal king begging for aid, a father pleading for the release of his son. Some are polite, others are raw, but all are real, the kind of voices you don't expect to find pressed into clay. There's one letter from a prince, far from home, asking after his mother's health. He signs it with love and urgency. You can almost hear his voice through the centuries, shaky with worry. And there are treaties. Oh, the treaties. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy. Their scribes drafted agreements with neighboring kingdoms that outlined terms of peace, borders, marriage alliances, and oaths sworn under the watch of the gods. Perhaps the most famous is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed with Egypt's pharaoh Ramesses II. It is the earliest known international peace treaty, and the text survives both in Hittite and Egyptian records. Imagine it, two empires, once locked in brutal battle, now bound by words, by clay, by seals impressed with lions and falcons. The scribes made it so. In the palace of Hattusa, there was a chamber set aside for correspondence, the House of Tablets, a cool, dark room lined with shelves. Here, messages arrived daily from vassal states, spies, allies, and enemies. Runners brought them from the outer provinces, galloping for days across wind-blown plateaus to deliver a few inches of damp clay. And when a reply was required, the scribes worked quickly. A fire was lit to bake the message. A seal was pressed, often the king's personal emblem, carved in hard stone and worn around his neck. Then the tablet was wrapped in a clay envelope and sent out again, back through the dust and sun, to whatever waiting court or restless border town required it. Writing was so embedded in the Hittite way of life that even magic was recorded. There are tablets that describe healing spells, incantations, rituals to summon rain or drive out plague. One speaks of placing grain beneath a child's pillow to cure night terrors. Another details a ritual involving salt, fire, and the whispering of a god's name, not to be spoken aloud unless in a sacred tongue. Each of these tablets is a portal, a preserved thought, a voice that refused to fade. But for all this scribal splendor, there was always a risk: fire, war, decay. So much has been lost, entire libraries reduced to dust. But what remains, what endures, tells us more than dates and battles ever could. It tells us that the Hittites saw their world as something worth remembering, not because they thought it eternal, but because they knew it wasn't. In the quiet rooms where scribes once sat, we are given a rare gift, not just information, but humanity. The hand that trembled when writing a letter to a distant queen. The stylus that paused before recording a king's final command. The breath held, then released, as a seal pressed into soft clay. Words mattered, because through them, life could outlive the body. And even now, as we sit in darkness, listening, drifting, dreaming, those voices remain. They speak to us still, but diplomacy and writing, no matter how powerful, could not shield the Hittites from every rival. And soon, a foreign sun would rise over the plains of Syria. A battlefield would await, and two titans of the ancient world, Egypt and Hatti, would meet in dust and blood and silence. It was the spring of a year long lost, around 1274 BCE, by our modern counting. The earth was warm, the rivers swelled with meltwater. And south of the Hittite heartland, deep in the contested lands of Canaan and Syria, a war was brewing that would echo across centuries. This was not a border skirmish or a raid for cattle. This was something older, deeper, the kind of war born from pride, fear, and memory. The Hittites and Egyptians had been circling each other for decades. Two ancient giants, each convinced they held rightful sway over the lands between them, the rich trade cities, the caravan routes, the mountain passes and oases. For Egypt, the north was the gateway to Asia. For the Hittites, the south was the buffer against Nile ambition. Between them lay Kadesh, a fortified city on the Orontes River, nestled amid fields and groves. A prize, a symbol, a trigger. King Muwatalli II led the Hittites. Tall, broad, solemn. Not a man of grand speeches, but of cold strategy. He had watched the Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II, young, bold, hungry, march northward in search of glory, and Muwatalli had prepared. He gathered an army like none before. Hittite infantry from the homeland, disciplined, armored, quiet in the march. Chariots, of course, hundreds of them, each pulled by swift Anatolian horses, 2 or 3 warriors to a cart. But more than that, he summoned allies from Arzawa in the west, from the Hurrian lands, from vassal kings across the Euphrates. It was said that his host numbered tens of thousands, a flood of men, all answering to the storm god, all bearing the lion crest of Hatti. Ramesses, for his part, was no less confident. He marched at the head of 4 divisions, Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set, each with its own banners, captains, and chariots. His scribes and artists would later carve his exploits in stone. Walls and pillars showing the young pharaoh alone in battle, firing arrows with divine strength, routing his enemies by the will of the gods. But the truth, as it always is, was more complex. The battlefield was chaos. Ramesses, advancing quickly, believed the Hittites were far off, scattered, unready. His scouts were deceived by a clever ruse. 2 captured deserters fed him false intelligence, saying Muwatalli had retreated. In truth, the Hittite army was hidden, just beyond the river, waiting. When Ramesses arrived near Kadesh with only 1 division, the Hittites struck. Chariots thundered down, fast and brutal. The Egyptian lines shattered. Panic took hold. Ramesses himself was nearly killed, surrounded, cut off, fighting desperately. He would later say he was saved by the god Amun, who filled him with courage. Some say it was sheer luck. Others, the arrival of reinforcements. But in that moment, the Hittite ambush nearly ended the pharaoh's reign and Egypt's claim on the Levant. But Muwatalli, too, made an error. He did not press the advantage. Some say he hesitated, fearing overextension. Others believe he thought the victory assured. In any case, the Egyptians rallied. Ramesses regrouped, drove back the chariots, and by dusk, both sides lay exhausted in the dust. The Battle of Kadesh ended not in triumph, but in stalemate. Blood soaked the fields. The city still stood. Neither empire could claim decisive victory. And so, reluctantly, two great kings turned to their scribes, to clay and treaty. Years later, the Treaty of Kadesh was born, a document of peace, marriage, and mutual respect. The storm god and the sun god were invoked. Oaths were sworn. The world, for a time, held still, but beneath that stillness, something had shifted. The battle had shown the limits of power. Even kings could be caught unaware. Even mighty empires could bleed. For Muwatalli, the years after Kadesh were ones of quiet consolidation. He moved the capital from Hattusa to Tarhintassa, perhaps to be closer to the southern frontier, or perhaps for reasons still debated by scholars and dreamers. But whatever his reasons, his reign would not last much longer. And when he died, as all kings must, the question of succession would tear at the seams of the empire. Because while bronze can win battles and treaties can shape borders, only unity can hold an empire together, and that unity would soon begin to crack. But before we watch the slow unraveling of Hatti, let us pause, not in the shadow of war, but in the breath between reigns. Let us meet the king who followed, a ruler remembered not for bloodshed, but for wisdom, for faith, for rebuilding. His name was Hattusili. His name was Hattusili III, and he came to the throne in a moment thick with tension. The death of Muwatalli II had left the Hittite court adrift, caught between loyalties, old rivalries, and the quiet rumblings of ambition. It might have descended into bloodshed, and in some ways it nearly did. But Hattusili, younger brother to Muwatalli, stepped forward, not as a conqueror, not as a usurper, but as a stabilizer, and in doing so, he became one of the most remarkable kings Hatti would ever know. He was not meant to be king. That honor had passed to Muwatalli's son, the young Arhiteshub. The boy had taken the throne as King Mursili III, but his rule was brief and marked by division. He moved the capital back to Hattusa, possibly against the wishes of his father. He made decisions that alienated powerful nobles. And though his legitimacy was strong, his grasp on unity was fragile. Hattusili, now middle-aged, had spent much of his life as a general, a priest, a governor. He was no stranger to command. But more importantly, he was deeply religious, a devoted servant of the goddess Ishtar. It is said he spoke to her often, that her signs guided his path. Whether one believes this or not, what followed is clear. Hattusili challenged the young king. The empire held its breath. What could have been a brutal civil war, instead, became a carefully planned removal. Hattusili deposed Mursili III, not with wild violence, but with quiet, calculated authority. He declared the young king unfit. He claimed divine sanction, and then, with the support of nobles and priests alike, he took the throne himself. And when he did, something rare happened: peace. Hattusili did not lash out against those who opposed him. He wrote a political testament, a remarkable document explaining his actions. He spoke of duty, of divine calling, of the need for justice and order. It was not propaganda alone. There was sincerity in it, the kind that does not shout, but speaks plainly. He named his son Tudhalia as heir, not from bloodline alone, but from merit. He mended broken ties with regional allies, and most notably, he reached across the border to Egypt. Years after the Battle of Kadesh, after the wounds had scabbed but not healed, Hattusili wrote to Pharaoh Ramesses II. The two men had once stood on opposite sides of the same battlefield. Now, they stood on the edge of something different. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of diplomacy in the ancient world. A peace treaty was drafted, not of necessity, but of choice. A treaty of equals. In it, both empires promised not to attack one another. They agreed to mutual defense if one was invaded. They vowed to extradite fugitives, to speak truthfully, to honor the gods who watched from above. The treaty was written in both Hittite and Egyptian, sealed with divine witness, and to seal the bond further, Ramesses took a Hittite princess, Hattusili's daughter, as his queen. She would be called Mothor-Neferir in Egypt, her foreign name softened into the Nile tongue. Their marriage was more than symbolic. It was a bridge between Anatolia and Africa, between storm gods and sun gods, between peoples who had once bled beneath the same sky. Hattusili's reign, while not marked by sweeping conquests, was one of internal strength. He restored temples. He oversaw roads and archives. He ensured that the tablets of his predecessors were not lost. Under his hand, the empire was held together, not with fear, but with order, not with ambition, but with wisdom, and yet the cracks remained. Even the strongest walls show hairline fractures over time. Trade began to falter in the outer provinces. Minor kings grew restless. Climatic changes, droughts, shorter harvests brought whispers of famine. The old ways, so reliant on divine favor, began to strain under the pressure of earthly problems. Still, Hattusili remained calm. In one letter to Ramesses, he joked gently about the pharaoh's long silences. In another, he praised the arrival of Egyptian envoys as though they were sons returning from exile. These were not the words of a warlord. These were the words of a man who understood that empire, if it was to survive, had to evolve. When he died, he left behind not a legacy of battles, but of balance. A rare and precious thing in the ancient world, but the world does not sit still for long. As the throne passed to Tudhalia IV, son of Hattusili, the pressures facing Hatti would not wait. Storms gathered on the edge of the map, not armies, But something stranger, something less visible. The seas grew restless. Trade routes flickered like candlelight in wind. And from the islands and coasts to the west, a force unlike any other began to stir. The scribes would not understand it. The kings would not name it, but history would come to call it the Sea Peoples. And with their arrival, the age of empire would begin to unravel. Tudhaliya IV, son of Hattusili, stepped into power with a heavy mantle upon his shoulders. The empire he inherited was not broken, not yet, but it was strained. The borders held, but just barely. The harvests were thinner, the merchants less bold. And beyond the rim of the known world, strange things began to stir. Still, Tudhaliya ruled with conviction. Like his father, he was pious, devoted to the gods, especially to Tarhunt, the storm god of the skies. He rebuilt temples, commissioned rituals, and revived the great festivals that once filled Hattusa with music and light. In his eyes, devotion would steady the realm. And in many ways, it did for a while. But the world was changing in ways even the gods could not halt. To the west, the islands of the Aegean seethed with unrest. Long-established cities flickered out like stars before dawn. Trade broke down. Ports that once bustled with goods now stood silent. And across the eastern Mediterranean, whispers spread of raiders, of migrants, of people without a home, without a flag, but with weapons, ships, and a hunger that could not be reasoned with. The Egyptians would one day call them the Sea Peoples. To the Hittites, they were less defined shadows that arrived in the night, voices that came on the wind. They were not an army in the traditional sense. They were many fragments of fallen worlds, bound together by desperation. They moved like tidewater, flooding coasts, toppling cities, consuming what stood in their path. The Hittites, landlocked at their heart, but tied to the coasts by trade and grain, felt the pressure first not in battle, but in silence. Ships stopped arriving. Markets grew quiet. Letters from vassal cities, Ugarit, Carchemish, grew fewer, more frantic. There is one tablet, recovered centuries later, from the city of Ugarit. A letter written by a desperate king to a distant ally. In it, he begs for aid. The enemy is near, he says. Our ships are not in port. We are alone. No help came. The city was burned. And Hattie, watching from the north, realized the fire was moving closer. Tudhaliya tried to respond. He strengthened the defenses. He made offerings. He led campaigns against rebellious vassals and secured mountain passes. But there was a feeling, subtle at first, then unmistakable, that the tide had turned. The unity his grandfather had preserved, his father had mended, was now slipping through his fingers like dry earth. One of the last great projects of Tudhaliya's reign was the construction of a massive dam, the first of its kind in Anatolia, built to secure water, to fight back against the droughts that plagued the land. It was a feat of engineering, of hope. Even now, fragments of it remain. But Water alone could not feed an empire running out of breath. The sea peoples, meanwhile, moved with growing speed. The Egyptians repelled them, barely, in a great sea battle that left the Nile Delta littered with debris and broken dreams. But the Hittites, far from the coast and stretched thin, were less fortunate. It was not one battle that brought them down. It was many small cuts. Cities fell. Governors vanished. Grain grew scarce. Infighting resumed among nobles. The central power of the king flickered. And perhaps most crucially of all, the scribes stopped writing. When an empire ends, it does not always go with flame. Sometimes it ends with silence. We do not know the name of the last Hittite king. There may not have been one. The records break off in the reign of Suppiluliuma, II, son of Tuttalia. He fought naval battles, rare for the Hittites, perhaps trying to repel the sea peoples from allied ports. But after that, nothing. No tablets, no letters, no lists of offerings, only quiet. In the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists found evidence of fire, not scattered, not chaotic, but precise. Palaces and temples burned. The great archives left abandoned, clay tablets shattered or buried beneath fallen beams. It does not appear to have been a siege in the traditional sense. Perhaps it was abandonment, or betrayal, or collapse from within. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The capital fell, the empire dissolved, and the world, as the Hittites had known it, passed into dust. And yet, not all was lost. Fragments of the Hittite world lived on in the cities of the south, in the lands of Syria, in the memory of scribes who taught others to write in their scripts. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms would rise, smaller and scattered, keeping alive the flame, however dim. But the golden age of Hatti, the age of kings and chariots, treaties and tablets, had ended. Still, even in ending, the Hittites left something behind. Their voices, pressed into clay, waiting for someone, perhaps you, perhaps me, to sit quietly in the dark and listen. Now, as the fires fade and the winds carry off the dust of empire, a question remains. What becomes of memory when even the stones forget? The fall of the Hittite Empire did not erase it. No, the end of Hattusa was not a curtain call, but more like the fading of a song. The melody still lingers, faint, in other places. In the hills, in broken fortresses, in scattered clay tablets buried deep in the earth. And from these fragments, we piece together the quiet after the storm. What followed the empire was not silence, but scattering. Out of the ashes of Hatti rose the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, smaller regional powers formed by descendants and remnants of the once great empire. These polities, like Carchemish, Melid, Kama, and Gurgum, dotted the landscape from southeastern Anatolia into northern Syria. They did not claim the world as their fathers did, but they did remember, and in remembering, they preserved a glimmer of what was. These were city kingdoms, each ruled by a local monarch, often still bearing names drawn from Hittite royal tradition. Their walls bore inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs, a script rooted in the same tongue spoken centuries earlier in Hattusa. They continued to worship old gods, Tarhunt, the storm lord, Ishtar of the battle cry, and Hepat, the mother goddess of Arena. Rituals once carried out under royal canopy were now offered in humbler sanctuaries, yet the devotion remained. Their power, however, was limited. They were not empires, they were survivors. By this time, new players filled the vacuum the Hittites had left behind. The Assyrians to the east, rising with military precision and brutal intent. The Phrygians, mysterious and bold, who began carving their stories into the rock faces of central Anatolia. And to the west, the Greeks, once scattered tribes, now growing into something altogether different. But the Neo-Hittite kingdoms endured for centuries, holding fast to the legacy of their ancestors. They traded, they wrote, they fought. Some allied with Assyria, others resisted. Some were swallowed quietly, others burned. But one by one, they were pulled under by the rising tides of history. The last of them faded sometime in the 8th century BCE, absorbed into Assyrian provinces. Their languages vanished. Their gods were replaced. Their names, for a time, were lost to memory. Yet memory is a strange thing. It doesn't disappear. It drifts. And so, centuries later, when Greek historians began writing of the past, they remembered rumors of a great northern people. They called them the Syro-Cappadocians, or sometimes confused them with the Phrygians or Lydians. It wasn't until the 19th century CE, in our own time, that the truth began to stir once more. It began with broken tablets in the ruins of Hattusa, now just hills and scattered stone. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of cuneiform fragments, preserved beneath layers of ash and earth. The words, though silent for over 3,000 years, still bore the voices of kings, priests, generals, and scribes. There were laws, treaties, myths, prayers. Letters sent to Egypt, to Babylon, to vassal kings. Inventories of grain, lists of soldiers, records of omens. Even the instructions for royal rituals, how many goats to sacrifice, which hymns to sing, what time of day to greet the storm god. It was a library buried in flame, yet miraculously intact. And slowly, scholars learned to read the language. They pieced together the history, not just of kings and wars, but of people, of bakers, farmers, merchants, scribes, of midwives and temple servants and builders who carved their prayers into stone. What emerged was not just an empire, but a civilization. A people who believed that the world was made of balance between heaven and earth, king and god, man and nature. A people who carved their laws into tablets not for pride, but for memory. Who signed treaties not just in ink, but in the names of gods. Who prayed to the wind and sang to the sun. And you, here tonight, have walked with them. You've sat beneath the same stars they once watched from the citadel of Hattusa. You followed their footsteps through battlefields and palaces, past temples and treaties. And now, in this moment, in this breath, you are part of their memory. Because history is not only what is written, it is what is heard, what is carried. And though the last of the Hittite kings may have vanished into dust, and though their language fell silent for 3,000 years, tonight they spoke again. Through you. But there is one last tale still to be told, one final descent into the myths and legends that held the Hittite heart together. For even after cities fall, stories endure. And the Hittites, like all ancient peoples, were never content with mere fact. They dreamed of gods and monsters, of giants and lost worlds. So now, let us turn to those dreams. The Hittite myths were not just entertainment. They were blueprints of belief, woven with echoes of older Anatolian traditions, of Hurrian gods from the east, and Babylonian influence drifting in on the winds of trade and conquest. They were tales whispered in temples, sung by priests, and etched into ritual tablets to be read aloud at festivals. They were not meant for sleep, and yet, somehow, they lull the listener, soft as a summer breeze through pine trees. The center of their mythology was the storm god Tarhunt, sometimes called Teshub in his Hurrian form. He was the bringer of rain, the rider of clouds, the protector of kings. He wielded thunder as a weapon and stood watch over the order of the universe. But even he was not all-powerful. He, too, had to struggle. One of the most enduring tales is that of the slaying of the dragon, a myth as old as civilization, and perhaps older still. In it, Tarhunt must face the great serpent Ilyanka, a coiling creature of chaos. In the first version of the tale, the storm god is defeated by the dragon. He is humiliated, stripped of his power. The world tilts toward disorder, but with cleverness and patience, he regains his strength. He weds the daughter of a mortal man, uses deception, and finally, with the aid of his son, slays Ilyanka and restores the cosmic balance. It is not a story of strength alone. It is a story of loss, of strategy, of rebirth. The Hittites told it each spring, when storms returned to the highlands, when the earth stirred again. It was more than myth, it was a rhythm, a pulse that tied their faith to the breath of the land itself. In another tale, the goddess Inara, daughter of Tarhunt, plays a crucial role. She prepares a great feast, a trap for the dragon. She seduces the mortal Suppiluliuma to aid her, promising him love in return. Together, they capture Ilyanka in a net. It is a story woven with sensuality, with hunger, with the intertwining of divine and human fates. Inara herself becomes something of a shadowed figure, a goddess of protection and mystery, vanishing into myth after her role is complete. Her fate, never fully resolved, was likely part of the ritual drama, a disappearance that reminded the people of the world's impermanence. These stories were not fixed. They existed in multiple versions, some contradicting each other, some written in Hurrian, others in Hittite. They were alive, not bound to one truth, and within them lived a worldview unlike our own. The Hittites believed in a universe where gods could fail, where order was fragile, where the divine needed the help of mortals. Their myths were not about perfection. They were about survival, about negotiating peace between chaos and structure, year after year, harvest after harvest. Even death was not an ending. The underworld, known as the Dark Earth, was not a place of eternal torment, but a gloomy echo ruled by deities like Lelwani, a goddess with roots in older Anatolian belief. The dead did not disappear. They lingered, remembered through libations, rituals, and the slow burning of incense. To forget them was to break the link between worlds. One prayer tablet recovered from Hattusa reads, "O gods of our ancestors, do not turn your faces away. We offer you drink, we offer you words. Remember us as we remember you." There was deep humility in this, a recognition that the living did not stand alone, and that the divine was not unreachable. It was present in wind, water, stone, and fire. Their mythology even made space for humor. In some rituals, actors portrayed gods in argument or frustration. A famous fragment tells of a god scolding a human priest for failing to complete the ceremony properly, berating him like an annoyed elder. The divine here was not distant. It was close enough to laugh at. In Hittite temples, myths were more than stories. They were reenacted, revived. The priests wore the garments of gods. They chanted the old lines. They poured wine on the earth and sang to the sky. For a moment, myth became present. The boundaries between now and then, between man and God, dissolved. It's easy to forget, in the shadows of modernity, how much people once relied on stories not for escape, but for understanding. The world was vast, uncertain. Disease, drought, invasion, these were not just events. They were signs, messages. And so, the Hittites turned to their myths for answers, for patterns, for peace. Now, as we rest here, wrapped in the hush of night, consider how many generations listened to these same tales beneath oil lamps and star-watched skies. How many children fell asleep hearing of Inara's feast. How many elders nodded solemnly as the serpent met its end again and again, year after year. And how strange, how beautiful, that you are hearing it now, across a gulf of 3,000 years. The myths endured not because they were factual, but because they held truth, not in the head, but in the heart. And perhaps that is why they still matter. But we are not yet done, for even myth cannot exist without the hands that record it. Next, let us meet the scribes, the keepers of memory, the quiet custodians of a lost world, whose careful tablets are the only reason we know the Hittites at all. In a corner of the royal citadel of Hattusa, tucked behind the larger palaces and courtyards, stood a modest structure, unassuming, low-roofed, often cool in the shade. Within its walls sat rows of clay shelves, stone benches, reed styluses, and dozens, perhaps hundreds, of scribes hunched over damp tablets, carefully pressing each wedge of cuneiform into soft earth before it dried. They were not celebrated. Their names were rarely recorded, but these men, and in some rare cases, women, held the empire's mind. The Hittite scribes were the inheritors of a long tradition, borrowing heavily from the scribal schools of Mesopotamia. The script they used, cuneiform, had traveled westward over centuries, first carved by Sumerians, then Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. By the time it reached Hattusa, it was already ancient. But the Hittites did something rare. They adapted it to their own tongue. The Hittite language, called nestled, is the oldest known Indo-European language ever written. Its sound and structure echo distantly in modern tongues, from Greek to Latin to English. It is strange and familiar, like hearing the echo of an ancestor through water. The scribes wrote in multiple languages. In Hattusa's archives, we find Hittite, Hurrian, Akkadian, Sumerian, and Luwian, all nestled together. Some texts are bilingual. The same prayer repeated line for line in two tongues, like a chant meant for both heaven and earth. And what they recorded was extraordinary. There were annals of kings, tracing campaigns year by year, treaties like the Great Pact between Hatti and Egypt, written with precise legal terms and divine witness. Mythological texts, copied from oral traditions or older nations, legal codes, spells, medical recipes, omens, dream interpretations, inventories of goods, and letters from governors seeking guidance. There are tablets that speak of missing sheep, of birth omens, of a king's headaches. One even contains a spell to cure a toothache, invoking magic and murmured words from unknown gods. But perhaps the most touching of all are the prayers. Some are formal, addressed by kings in high ritual, but others are raw, confessional, painfully human. One such tablet reads, "O storm god, I have sinned against you. I have broken the oath. I am but your servant. Do not cast me down." We do not know the name of the person who wrote this, only that they believed in the gods, feared their wrath, and longed to be forgiven. And that, somehow, their voice remains. The scribes did more than record. They translated, copied, edited, and preserved. Each time a tablet wore thin or cracked, a new one was made. Sometimes the older version was kept, stored in wooden boxes, or sealed in jars. In this way, myths hundreds of years old were kept alive, even as kings changed and borders shifted. Their training began young. A scribe in training would first learn to shape clay, to hold the stylus correctly. Then came practice tablets, rows of repeated signs. Then basic vocabulary. Then sentence structure. Only much later, full texts. It could take a decade to become proficient. Longer still, to understand the religious and legal nuance required for temple or court work. They were not just secretaries. They were scholars. When the empire crumbled, Many scribes likely perished with it, but some continued. In the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, tablets were still written. Some scribes carved inscriptions on walls instead, adapting the old hieroglyphic Luwian script. Their purpose remained unchanged: to remember. And even in forgetting, they succeeded. Because 3,000 years later, long after their temples fell and their gods faded, we found them again. In the early 20th century, archaeologists working at the site of Hattusa uncovered the great archive, room after room of clay tablets, some intact, others shattered, buried beneath centuries of ash and soil. It was a discovery that redefined what we knew of the ancient world. Until then, the Hittites were almost myth, a faint mention in Egyptian and biblical texts, a shadow people. Suddenly, they had a voice, 1,000 voices, a whole world written in clay. It took decades to decipher their words. Even now, many tablets remain untranslated. But every year, more is learned. Every year, another scribe is heard again across the ages. Imagine them now, seated in their stone rooms, the dry wind whispering through a window, clay on their hands, the scent of damp earth, the weight of language heavy in their fingers, knowing that what they write will serve a king, perhaps a god, but never imagining it might one day reach someone like you, that you now lying in the hush of your room, listening in the dark, would be the one to receive their words. The Hittites did not believe memory was eternal. They believed it had to be fed, with words, with fire, with faith, and so let us feed it still. Next, let us descend into the heart of Hattusa, to walk its streets, climb its walls, and feel what life may have been like in the capital of an empire at its height. You would have seen it long before you arrived. Even from a distance, Hattusa was immense. Nestled in a high mountain basin, encircled by wooded ridges and steep rock faces, it was carved into the very bones of the earth. Its outer walls stretched for over 6 kilometers, winding like a serpent along the hills. Guard towers stood tall at intervals, and 5 great gates pierced its defenses. Each gate bore its own story, its own god, most famous of all, the Lion Gate. 2 massive stone lions carved in relief, standing silent watch over those who entered. Their eyes were fixed not on the road, but slightly downward toward you, as if they recognized every soul that passed beneath them, as if they remembered. Inside, the streets of Hattusa twisted through sloping terrain. It was not a city of neat, flat plains. It clung to the land, rose and dipped with the hills. There were homes here, made of mud brick and stone, with courtyards and storage rooms and rooftop terraces. Narrow alleys connected neighborhoods. Children played in dust. Smoke rose from cookfires. Laughter, arguments, dogs barking, chickens pecking at the ground. To the west, near the lower city, loomed the great temple, a vast complex of courtyards, storerooms, shrines, and ritual chambers. This was the sacred heart of Hattusa. Here, the king himself offered sacrifices to the storm god of Hatti, and the sun goddess of Arena. Offerings of oil and grain were poured into basins. Goats and bulls were led to their fates. Priests chanted in languages ancient even then, repeating lines written by scribes on sacred tablets stored in sealed niches. And then there was the upper city, the royal district, elevated like a crown. It was here the king and his court resided, along with his archives, his council chambers, his personal temples. It was here that foreign dignitaries were received, treaties negotiated, prisoners judged, and rituals performed behind closed doors, all under the watch of the gods. The buildings here were grand, but austere. Hittites favored solidity over opulence. Thick walls, well-cut stone, high gates. There was power in the architecture, but also restraint, a sense that the gods, not men, were the true rulers. And scattered throughout the city were rock sanctuaries, natural outcrops where the divine was believed to dwell. The most sacred of these was Yazilikaya, just outside the city walls. Here, in a narrow stone ravine, the gods of the Hittite pantheon were carved into the rock face, rows upon rows of deities marching in eternal procession. Male and female, storm and sun, sword and flower. You can still visit them. The carvings remain. But what of the people? The pulse beneath the stone. Imagine a craftsman up before dawn, shaping bronze tools. A weaver at her loom, knotting wool into complex patterns. A baker kneading flatbread. A temple servant fetching water. A young soldier polishing his helmet, whispering a prayer to Tarhunt before his first patrol. Festivals were frequent. They were moments when the city bloomed. Music filled the streets, flutes, lyres, drums. Dancers in bright fabrics twirled in open plazas. The king emerged, not as a warrior, but as a priest bearing offerings. The gods were thanked for fertility, for rain, for peace. And the people rejoiced, if only for a few days, free of worry. But Hattusa was not without fear. Droughts came. Grain ran short. Foreign armies threatened the gates. Political intrigue swirled in palace corridors. There were assassinations, betrayals, rebellions. The king was powerful, yes, but always under the gaze of heaven. He could be deposed. He could be cursed. No throne was forever. And then there were the nights, still and dark, the wind whispering through pine, oil lamps flickering in narrow windows, dogs howling. Somewhere, a priest murmuring prayers. Somewhere else, a scribe finishing his tablet, a mother singing softly to a restless child. The sky above, full of stars, the same stars you see now. This was Hattusa, a city of contrasts, imperial and intimate, sacred and mundane, a city built by hands long gone, but whose prints remain in stone and earth. And when the end came, it came not in one moment, but in a slow unraveling. Trade dried up. Borders grew fragile. The great kings lost their grip. Invaders came, perhaps the sea peoples, perhaps internal revolts. The palaces were abandoned. The gates left open. The last fires burned out. But even in its fall, Hattusa did not vanish. It simply slept. It slept beneath the soil for over 3,000 years, until one day, not so long ago, curious minds began to dig. And from that dust came tablets. From those tablets, voices. And from those voices, this very story. As you lie now, still and listening, know that you've walked through its streets. You've seen its walls. You've stood at the Lion Gate. The city lives again, not with stone or fire, but within you. But before we end, let us take one last breath with the Hittites, not of politics, nor of gods, but of their philosophy, of how they saw the world, and how that view still matters. To the Hittites, the world was not built for certainty. It was a place of balance, fragile, ever-shifting. The sun could shine, but it could also scorch. The rain could feed crops, but it could also flood homes. The gods could bless, and the gods could curse. Life was lived between those extremes, and so they made peace with the in-between. Hittite law was less about punishment and more about restoration. If someone stole an ox, they repaid it, perhaps with interest, but they were not maimed or executed. If someone committed a grave offense, ritual cleansing was often required, not vengeance. The goal was to restore balance, not to demand blood. They believed that justice meant healing the wound, not deepening it. There is a particular kind of wisdom in that. They were not utopians. Their world was hard. Drought, famine, invasion, betrayal. These were not just possibilities, but frequent realities. And yet, they did not surrender to despair. They built temples. They told stories. They left prayers etched in clay. They remembered. One of their most telling traditions was the notion of ritual apology. If a king or priest suspected that the gods were angry, he did not simply offer gifts. He admitted fault, even if no mistake was known. He assumed some error had occurred, and he addressed it openly. In one tablet, a king writes, "O gods, I do not know the sin of my father's house, nor the sin of my own hands. But if I have transgressed in word or in silence, forgive me. Look not upon my error, but upon my offering." That is not arrogance. That is humility. That is the voice of a people who knew that perfection was not possible, but that sincerity still mattered. There is something incredibly human in this, something that speaks to us across the centuries. The Hittites knew that order could collapse in a generation. That fame faded, stone crumbled, and even the gods could go silent. But that was never an excuse to live carelessly. On the contrary, it was a reason to live mindfully, to build strong homes, to raise children with stories, to write down what mattered, to walk gently with the sacred, and to speak truth, even in whispers. They also had a strikingly modern sense of diplomacy. While they were warriors, they understood the cost of endless war. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, remains one of the oldest surviving peace treaties in history. It speaks not of dominance, but of respect, of mutual recognition. It's even written in both Hittite and Egyptian, each party addressed with honor. In this treaty, the two empires agreed to stand together against future enemies. They exchanged daughters in marriage, ambassadors in peacetime, and prayers for the health of one another's kings. It was a delicate, human understanding. No one ruled forever. Better to coexist when possible. Perhaps most profound of all was their relationship with time. Unlike modern histories, which often obsess over linear progress, the Hittites viewed time in cycles of seasons, of rule, of divine favor and divine silence. Nothing was permanent, but nothing was entirely lost. Everything could return if properly honored. Even you, now listening, are part of that return. The stories you've heard tonight of storms and scribes, of kings and serpents, of walls and whispers were nearly lost. For centuries, not a soul remembered the names of Suppiluliuma, of Tarhunt, of Hattusa. The empire was dust, the gods were shadows, and yet here we are. In your quiet room, wherever you are in the world, the Hittites live again. Their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, they have reached you. You have heard them. You have remembered. And that is perhaps the most Hittite thing of all. Not glory, not conquest, but continuity. A thread, fragile yet unbroken, stretched across millennia. So take a moment now. Let it all settle. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Feel the weight of time like a gentle hand on your shoulder. You've walked with an empire. You've heard the voice of a forgotten world. You've made the dead speak simply by listening. And that is no small magic. Thank you for joining me tonight. If this journey stirred something in you, a curiosity, a calm, a sense of wonder, I invite you to leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's connect across the globe, across the silence. If you'd like to continue exploring ancient stories together, feel free to subscribe. There's so much more to discover. So many voices waiting to rise from the dust. Until then, sleep well. Let the winds of Anatolia carry you softly into dreams, and may the memory of the Hittites keep you company through the night.